Are we ready to go now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, welcome everybody to this panel on community space and television. We're here bright and early in the UK, not everywhere else, obviously, and we're very happy to see you all. So we're going to run the papers in the order as given on the programme. So it's my great pleasure. Sorry, I'm Hannah Andrews of the University of Lincoln. I'm chairing this panel. Always forget to do it. We're going to start this morning with Jana Jedličková, and I'm just going to hand straight over to you because everybody's more prepared than I am and they already know how to do the tech. So
thank you, Anna.
Pleasure.
I'll just switch my presentation. If for any reason you can't see it, just let me know. But it's supposed to work. I mean, we've tried it, so hopefully it will work. I don't have any sound, so let's just focus on the image. My presentation is called How I Decided to Research Regional / Local Television in Czechia, Central Europe. And what I essentially wanted to do when I sent the proposal to the conference, I had this idea about how we could research regional television. And when I say regional, sometimes in academic papers the term local is used as well. So I used the terms regional and local as synonyms, even though we could define each term in a very specific way. But for the purpose of this presentation, I actually find them to be very, very similar, at least in my case. And I had this project in mind where I wanted to focus on how regional or local television in Czechia looks like. And when I started to do preliminary research or research the field of this theme, I found out that there's not many works done on regional television at all, and not only in Czech Republic, which is kind of understandable because television studies as an official academic discipline exists only for about 7 to 8 years now. But I also looked to other types of research in media studies and TV studies abroad, and I found out there aren't many academic articles or monographies on such a topic. So I started thinking about firstly, why there isn't any material I could inspire or be inspired with, and also what types of themes are researched or investigated if anyone already is interested in local TV industries or local or regional TV content. And also, why is it that we as academics usually know and have way more sources on American and British television or global streaming portals than on local television and such specific regions, like, for example, European television or from European point of view, for example, TV industries in Africa or Asian television industries and so on. So the goal of this presentation is firstly to sort of introduce how local or regional television is actually researched nowadays, then suggest a few themes and topics which we could or possibly even should be paying attention to. And then I wanted to briefly introduce how regional television looks like in Czech Republic and why I think it's important to be interested in such topic as well, but not only research global streaming portals such as Netflix or HBO Max or public service televisions in Europe, but to focus more on local and regional TV productions as well, because they are very interesting. And as I will suggest later on, they are quite significant for cultural heritage as well. Firstly, contemporary research of regional television. What I found out from my very brief investigation of texts and papers on regional and local TV industries, most of the papers and most of the research is actually focused only on news and current affairs programming. Which kind of makes sense because there is quite a large amount of regional and local televisions and TV companies that are focused only on news programming and current affairs programming of local importance. Also, there are quite a lot of papers that are focused on politics and ideology of local TV broadcasting and nowadays also streaming. This is also something that, for example, is of interest in Czech Republic. There are quite a lot of independent companies and non-profits that are interested in knowing how regional televisions actually are connected to regional politics and how those televisions are actually financed. Because, for example, it's against the Czech media law that news and current affairs programming is financed by political parties or by official representations of local towns, for example. But many of local televisions are actually financed by towns, for example, and they are used as an advertising companies, even though they should report about the communities and events that are important for local communities. Then there are some papers on local and regional TV industries, though they are very, very scarce, but they are nonetheless very, very interesting. Also, a few papers on regional and local television as digital media, which is quite interesting because, for example, in Czech Republic, there's a large amount of local televisions that just have an official website and they do broadcast, but they are basically functioning only through social media such as Facebook and Instagram. Facebook is way more popular than Twitter, for example, in Czech Republic, and also on YouTube. And YouTube is actually used as a supplementary portal for TV broadcasting for lots of those local televisions. Then there are, for example, in Spain and in Scandinavian countries, and I think in India, for example, as well, there are quite a lot of papers and research done on histories of regional TV content or TV and gender representations. And if I go to Czech Republic, there are quite a lot of articles and BA and MA theses that aren't actually published, that are focusing on news and current affairs programming as well. Also, and that's quite popular with students, especially in bachelor programs, gender representations in the context of regional and local television, and also a radio, which is often connected in regions. And nowadays, one type of ethnographic studies that are focusing on how actually those regional TV companies are working, how are their production and distribution models, for example, or business models. It's one of the new popular ways how to look at regional televisions. But if I would focus on the numbers of the papers, they are very scarce. What we do have a lot are unpublished BA and MA theses, where the students usually go and work as journalists or presenters in local televisions or in Czech public service television, and they don't follow their research. So we do have lots of starting studies or case studies, but they are getting old pretty quickly, basically. Just a brief visual representation of how Czech TV landscape actually looks like if we focus only on official regional televisions. There are approximately 25 5 of them. Lots of them are only streaming on YouTube or those mentioned social media such as Facebook, and later on Instagram as well. And then Czech Public Service Television actually has regional editorial offices, but those are offices that are kinda being part of national program of Czech Public Service Television. So I don't count them in the research of regional and local televisions in Czechia. So what and how to analyze if we are interested in regional television? There are quite a lot of themes and topics that are being forgotten or ignored in those papers I mentioned, and lots of them are actually getting more and more interested in the connection of digitalization, also culture of convergence, because as I mentioned, lots of regional televisions can't simply afford studio where they would produce their content, and their distributional practices, for example, are a bit different from national televisions because they don't have lots of money, or because they have other businesses that are being part of those TV companies. For example, in Czech Republic, it's quite common that regional televisions are being partially linear or non-linear televisions, but they are also production companies that are creating advertisement for local businesses, companies, and so on. What is also very interesting, especially to me, is how digitalization is influencing local media, because as I mentioned, the use of YouTube as an archive and a way to broadcast or stream to audiences and be more relevant to contemporary and especially younger audiences is quite strong nowadays. And there are even the cases of regional media that are only connecting with their viewers, regional viewers, through social media, for example. Also, the local business models are quite interesting. As I already mentioned, lots of them are against the law, but because those are regional televisions, our media organs don't control them that heavily as, for example, Czech Public Service Television. And also it's quite interesting to ask ourselves who is actually watching regional media and how many of those people are watching, because usually when regional media are competing for public support, or they are trying to buy or engage local businesses for advertisement, they usually use metrics of suggested audiences, not the real authentic ones. So it's interesting to think about how those regional media actually connect to viewers, if they are connecting with the target audiences, and how they do that, because those regional local media are nowadays they are having quite an old staff, or people that are working in those regional televisions are usually older, and they usually come from the age of broadcast television. So they are actually learning to work with social media as well. And it's quite interesting to follow the communicational strategies of targeting younger audiences as well. Then there's the question of how to do that. When I started to be interested in regional television, I quickly realized that if we are about to do it properly, there's gonna be lots of data. Not only because those regional televisions operate on social media, but because there's quite a lot of content, and Also, it's not only news and current affairs programming, but there's quite a lot of magazines that are focusing on the history of the region or the communal life in the region and so on. What comes as a natural suggestion is use of digital humanities methods and tools for which you need to work with the software, for example. Also, ethnographic methods are quite useful. If we are about to learn something or anything about regional TV, we have to know how they operate, how they work, how the content is created, what motivates people to work for regional media, and so on. And then, of course, there's good old qualitative research methods focusing on the content and ideology, for example. What I actually suggest is to reframe regional televisions or local media as places and spaces who create news and current affairs programming only. Because for example, in Czech Republic, there's quite a lot of regional and local televisions, and I'll show you briefly in a minute, that are focusing on the history of the region. They are focusing on traditional customs, on folk traditions, for example, and this is the content that's not particularly interesting for national televisions, especially for the commercial ones. But regional televisions create such content quite often, and they not only create it, they usually also archive it on YouTube or in social media. So they basically create a sort of an archive of cultural heritage of these regions. And they also not only create an archive on social media, but they usually create platforms on their websites or on YouTube where they not only put on audiovisual content, but sometimes they even create texts, blogs, articles about specific topics on cultural histories and cultural heritage, and so on. And I just wanted to present some of the examples of regional televisions working as an archive of cultural heritage. And all those screenshots that you will see are actually from regional programming. They are from different programs from different regional televisions, but what they have in common is the focus on cultural heritage, on regional heritage, on the history or the traditions, customs, and so on. And all of them are coming from magazine programming, basically, or from cooking shows, for example, that are specifically created for target audiences living in those local communities and very specific regions. This screenshot, for example, is from a program that introduces the custom of Christmas in Czech lands, and they introduce the merge of Slavic and German Christmas traditions at the end of 19th and the beginning of 20th century. Most of the programs, beside news and current affairs programming, are actually focusing on folk traditions and customs. Czech Republic is, in historical terms, very interesting because it lies in Central Europe. And for quite a large amount of historical time, and our culture was not only Slavic, but it was also mixing with German and Austrian culture, for example. So lots of those folk traditions and customs aren't actually only Slavic, but they are meshed up, so to speak, with German and Austrian traditions as well. So what you can see is another historical magazine that is trying to explain its viewers where the traditions of celebrating Christmas and the born of Jesus Christ were actually where they started, how they looked like, and how are they celebrated now. This one is a very special tradition that is quite common in Czech Republic, but also in specific parts of Austria. For example, it's the celebration of St. Nicholas Day, which is the custom in Czech Republic is celebrated on the 5th of December every year, and the St. Nicholas Day is on the 6th December. It's basically the celebration that's focusing, or the custom is connected to little children actually, and we have these 3 characters, as you can see on the upper left picture, which is the screenshot from again from a historical magazine that's focusing on the tradition of St. Nicholas Day, and you have 3 wax figurines. One of them is St. Nicholas. The second one is the angel, and the third one is the sprite, or in Czech literally little devil. You can see horns, for example, here. The lower picture is actually how the custom is celebrated in Czech society throughout the whole republic, actually, and it's quite common that those types of pictures or scenes are streamed in and broadcasted in every television and every news, for example, the next day, because it's one of those customs that are very specific for Czech Republic. But as we can see on the bigger picture on the right, it can also be very regionally specific, because when a Czech person looks at those types of St. Nicholas Day celebrations, they immediately know that the bigger picture is actually a very traditional custom and very traditional holidays that's held in very specific part of Moravia, because the masks are actually a bit different from the common celebrations of St. Nicholas Day. To go further, logically, most of regional and local televisions are focusing on community life. Very popular, for example, are fire squad competitions. Lots of children are actually competing and learning how to tame the fires, for example. And when I was searching for a screenshot in almost every regional Czech television, I found some magazine or some articles on those types of competitions. And not only on the competitions and firefighters per se, but on their way to connecting to local communities, which again is very important for regional and local televisions, because the life of the community, especially if the community is connected to some specific types of traditions, as is the second screenshot with the traditional costumes in South Moravia, in Dolní Bojanovice. You can see one of these celebrations where the traditional costumes are being worn, and it's one of the typical communal celebrations that are repeated every year, and that's very typical regional programming, along with programs that are focusing on regional arts and crafts that are specific for regions. And now it gets quite interesting, because magazines that are focusing on regional arts and crafts, again connected to specific folk traditions and customs, usually are also very often sponsored by local businesses. So in the picture on the left, you can, for example, see a person who's creating a glass bird, and the person on the left is embroiling in a very traditional way a cloth. And again, traditional customs. There's lots of Moravian regional televisions that are filled with magazines focusing only just on this type of business and those types of traditions. So basically, the communal life, the traditions, but also the business structure of the region is connected in the regional programming. Here again, some traditional pastry from Vizovice, which is again very traditional region, and the rest of the pictures are actually very traditional and very specific way how to decorate Easter eggs in not only in Moravia, which this type of ornamenting is typical for South Moravia, but it's also very typical celebration of Easter in Czech Republic. Cooking shows that are connected to traditions and to traditional meals and foods are very popular in Czech Republic and in regional televisions, and especially if you are watching Moravian regional televisions. Everyone has some sort of cooking show where there are usually two women, unlike in national televisions where men are usually the cooks and presenters. But in regional televisions, women are usually the presenters, and there's usually also the age difference where you have the older, very experienced female cook and the younger one that needs to learn to cook. So she would be able to find a husband. So that is another very interesting topic that should be researched as well. And the last slide of my presentation before I sum up my talk. Lots of those regional televisions are focusing on micro-histories of the specific regions as well, not only to the connection to the traditions and folk customs, but also on tradition per se. Czech Republic is full of chateaus and castles, for example. It's also a place that in every region there's quite a lot of legends and myths connected to larger histories of Europe and Central Europe, but also to micro histories of those specific tiny regions. And what is very popular are actually travel magazines that are focusing on, for example, in this case, on different castles in Eastern Bohemia. So just to sum it up, regional televisions are a seriously under-researched topic in television studies, but it's also a very fascinating topic of TV studies research, not only because how these televisions actually survive in the time of media convergence and digitalized media landscapes, but also because they are very local and they are closely connected to the regions they operate in, and they also serve as an archive of local histories, culture heritage, and they are able to connect with their audiences through the histories of the region. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please ask me after all of us present.
Thank you so much, Jana. Fascinating. And yes, if people do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Okay, so our next presenter, according to the program, is going to be Elke Weissmann, who we may have heard of. Elke, I'm going to pass over to you. Elke is reader at Edge Hill University.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah. So it's brilliant that Jana went fast, because in many ways her talk is completely setting up what I'm going to talk about. So thank you. I'm actually representing myself and Belinda Tyrrell, who's from the University of Liverpool. The two of us are working on a project together that is British Academy funded, which is about climate action, local communities and local television. So how does this all connect to the outliers of television studies? As Jana has already kind of indicated, you know, there is a lot of focus in television studies on national or indeed international television studies. But as Roland Robertson has pointed out, you know, when we look at the age of globalization, which we're supposedly in, what is also happening is an increased emphasis on the local. So yes, we're looking at globalization and localization together, but television studies has tended to focus on the global bit, basically. So we're looking at how global formats are adapted into national systems, or how national systems create content that is then sent out into the world transnationally, basically. And we're talking about how this is making it conspicuously local. So Timothy Havens has talked about how he suddenly gets all this local television from across the world, but what he's really talking about is national television. And we really need to look at the micro-local. The micro-local is a term that Nick Andrews, in a conversation with me, used in order to describe what is actually happening in Wales and in Welsh television drama. And Welsh television drama is doing really, really well internationally. But interestingly, they go closer and closer into specific locations there. And then there's the other thing as well, which is about local activism, which Saskia Sassen has talked about. And local activism is basically increasingly operating against the nation as well. And the nation is becoming less important in many ways within the world of politics. You know, there's a lot of concern about the national democracies kind of falling apart. But at local level, there's a lot of activism, and they often operate within global networks with global connections. And that's what Saskia Sassen has talked about. So I'm going to introduce our project a little bit. I want to show quite a bit of one of the programs that we've made, and then discuss initial findings. So the project is officially called Community-Led Television, Local Voice and Climate Action. It is a collaboration between Edge Hill University. I am the principal investigator, the University of Liverpool, so Belinda is a co-investigator. And then we're working with a local community group called Love Wavertree Community Interest Company. And the British Academy have been great in terms of that they've obviously given us funding, but also they've been really able to support us theoretically and methodologically by bringing the people who are funded in that particular stream together for workshops. So it's been really, really good. So climate change is clearly a global emergency, but what needs to happen is really requiring local action. And it is precisely looking at what local action is happening already, or indeed what more we could do locally, which is the topic of this project. And the key question there is, how can we reach those that are not currently involved? Because Love Wavertree, when I started to talk to them, were basically saying to me, well, we've got lots and lots of people doing really great stuff, and then we have even more people who are not doing anything. And it's, how do we reach those other people? And traditionally, obviously, public service television has precisely done that, has precisely offered that. So nevertheless, it's important to recognise that there are clearly problems with public service television, and also actually, on the other hand, local television. So public service television has traditionally been understood to be too top-down and too paternalistic, particularly in the Reithian way that we recognise in the UK. So it's all about basically the elite telling people who are not elite, basically working class people in particular, what they should do. But I think, you know, there's an element of this still very much around, but there's an attempt to make working class people also, or indeed other people, giving other people a voice. But it is a continuous problem, and the BBC is aware of that, Channel 4 is aware of that, many other places are aware of that. In the UK, local television is now established as a commercial licensed programme, which means that basically when they were originally set up in the early 2010s, there were lots and lots of small companies. They increasingly merged, and now we have two main franchise holders, and that's TV and Now TV. There are other models beforehand, in particular community-led models, and they were mostly about media literacy. A good example is actually local in Liverpool, Toxteth TV, which was really, really famous because it came out of the Toxteth riots. And Toxteth riots were basically riots against racism in Liverpool and nationally more generally. And there was a recognition that you needed to be able to enable communities to talk, to use their own voice and get their own voice out there. So democratize the media in many ways in order to enable self-representation, but also in order to counteract what is already there. So Toxteth TV really facilitated that, and to some extent they continued this way into the 2010s actually, but they are now really defunct. So when you phone them or when you email them, basically all you get is no longer exists, though the space is still available. There are also alternative examples somewhere in between the kind of more commercial element and the more community-led element. So we have examples in Germany, Canada, and the USA. Don't have the time to go into them, but there's some interesting examples available. All of this obviously operates or has been discussed to some extent. There's a really, really good edited collection by Sarita Malik et al., which discusses community filmmaking more than community television. So the focus is more on filmmaking, which is then often distributed in a more amateur way. But what Malik et al. Emphasize is that this is really about addressing diversity and inclusion. So precisely what Toxteth TV have done, basically. And they really wanted to stress the importance of questions of civic engagement, so precisely the activist element of it. However, the way they describe it in the end, and this is Chapin, who's one of the co-editors in one of the introductions, community media and filmmaking emerged in the 1960s as a counteracting practice aiming to facilitate the production of cultural content often ignored in mainstream media. Howley defines community media as the range of community-based activities intended to supplement, challenge, or change the operating principles, structures, financing, and cultural forms and practices associated with dominant media. One key element of these activities has been to democratize media production by making them more participatory. So what you can see from that is precisely this idea of countering. And I think what we were trying to do is actually extend what is already there. So we wanted to really use ideas of public service broadcasting in order to facilitate community television, which is about local community and looking at what the local community is already doing. So they were, Love Wavertree was organizing climate assemblies, and they also support and indeed have their own local community projects that are climate-based. So we filmed these with the help of students, which was obviously positive for the students as well, because it gave them a client-led employability opportunity and they were paid for it, so they could also put that on their CV quite nicely. And we made that available via local channels, amongst others via a screening at the local town hall in Wavertree, and then it's also on YouTube, and I'll share the link with you later. But what is really interesting is basically we want to send that out via the newsletter of Love Wavertree as well, etc. And we want to expand that also into Liverpool more generally, because we've had quite a lot of interest from local communities about it already. So for us, as I said, it is an extension of PSB, particularly those two things that you can find on Channel 4 and the BBC actually as part of their remits. So Channel 4 is about championing diverse voices. That's definitely what we're trying to do. And also to reflect, represent and serve the diverse communities of all of the United Kingdom's nations and regions, and in doing so support the creative economy across the United Kingdom. Again, I think we did that quite well because we made it an opportunity for students to really hone their skills. So yes, they're already trained to a certain extent, but you know, we're giving them another opportunity that will help them hopefully to be more employable. Our focus was on climate change. Largely because that's the funding, but also because I personally have a really strong interest in that area. and Belinda, who's at the Heseltine Institute at Liverpool, her focus is also on local community and climate change, so it worked really well. But what I found really important when I was reading up on climate change in relation to the representation of climate change on television, what people have found again and again is that, you know, the way it's represented at the moment is so catastrophic that people become overwhelmed and basically end up not doing anything at all. And obviously that's not what we wanted to achieve. So I'm going to show you quite a lengthy clip, and it would be great if someone could indicate if you can see and hear everything okay. I think I've shared my computer sound. But yeah, hopefully you will enjoy. And this is made by our students, as I said.
Housing and health, I think it all kind of goes very much hand in hand. You may have read, if you live in Walton, your life expectancy is going to be 15 years lower than someone who lives in Chilwell.
What we're hoping to achieve with the assembly is that we hear what you want to see develop as policy. So your suggestions are being taken forward to, on the one hand, Love Wavertree, but on the other hand, also to Liverpool City Council, and we have direct contacts there. They're really interested, so there's real wish to engage with local communities in order to find out what we can all do together in a way.
Cheryl, could you tell us a little bit about Liverpool Healthy Homes and how the work that you're doing could potentially impact on climate?
Yeah, just going back slightly, Healthy Homes is funded by the public health team at Liverpool City Council. The reason why I come about is to look at the link between housing and health, and to look at reducing health inequalities. So basically we're looking at doing interventions into people's properties to help lift in terms of the energy efficiency of the property, and to be able to go in and give them general, what we call behavioural advice about how you live in your property, how you manage the property. At the moment, we're involved with BAYS who have provided funding in terms of driving more of a green agenda across the country. So that we're working with Liverpool City Regions Combined Authority. So we're in phase 2 of that at the moment. What we're looking at there is we're looking at going into people's properties and doing like an intervention in the sense of what the most effective and efficient energy efficiency measure would be done in that property. So what they look at the property itself, the energy performance of the property, and also the occupancy and the occupant's behaviour of managing the property.
So the 15-minute city concept has been adopted globally by many cities. Probably one of the biggest examples is Paris. And if anybody knows Paris, they'll know that for many years it's been synonymous with cars. You just have to think of the Arc de Triomphe, that huge roundabout that it's become with cars whizzing around it. But actually over the last 5 to 10 years, the radical leadership of Paris have managed to introduce a lot more cycle lanes and make the city a lot more connected via active travel and transport. It has many beneficial outcomes. One of the big ones, of course, being that it keeps a lot of money within the local economy. You're no longer travelling to somewhere on the outskirts of town to spend your money, which will disappear to some big financial headquarters down in London or wherever. It means that you can use your local baker, your local butcher, your local card shop, your local retail premises, which will keep the money within your community.
You know, people that will suffer with that.
Yeah, so thinking around these screening yards and things like that, do you think there are actions that the local authority could support with more? Or...
Yeah. I know there's like a couple of things like Scouse Flower people, and there is some people have done the alleys around here, like I think there is a helper or anything, but like anyway, I don't think it's the government's job to come in and like sort my alley out. I think it's our job to sort it out, but like support for it, where to move stuff to, like a blueprint.
Accessible information, isn't it? It's a bit like what I'm saying with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've learned in Manchester there was one high-rise block where they put air source heat pumps within that high-rise block, and it really relates to behaviour. So that behaviour at the moment with our gas boilers, our gas managers, etc., and you might have heard it at times, they say always keep your boiler on, keep it on low to kind of get that general heat. While it's counterintuitive because you don't want your boiler on the whole time, if you keep it low, it's actually, they allege, cheaper. I've got a workmate that tested it because I wasn't brave enough to try that long term, and they've said that it does work out cheaper.
So I hope that gave you a little bit of an indication of what the programs are like. Obviously, this was edited together, so it wasn't the program as you see it. It was edited together. So our key findings are basically around this this diagram. We realized that there are basically three branches of sustainable community. Sorry, let me say that again. There are three branches that make up a healthy and sustainable community. And these three branches are held up by three layers of communicative facilitation. Now, sorry for the awkward language. It will get better. We're still early on in the analysis, and so language is still a process, basically. So at community level, there is a sense of belonging that a good community has. So if you live somewhere where you feel you're part of a community, you feel that you belong. Similarly, it gives you a sense of identity. You are from Toxteth, from Maberty, from Kensington, wherever. And but it also facilitates collective action. At the next, on the next branch, we have climate justice. So this is about net zero, but this is also about things like air pollution. Liverpool has a dreadful level of air pollution, and in part that is because there's so many cars, because the city is completely built around cars. The problem is that the poorest communities basically get the most of the pollution because that's where all the cars are going through, basically. So there's something around that. It's also connected to climate action, obviously. And then the final and really, really closely intertwined branch with those other two branches is ideas of social equality and inclusion. You could even hear it, hopefully, in this clip. You know, at the beginning, she says, housing and health goes hand in hand, but housing is usually better and more climate efficient when it's also healthier. So these three things come together really, really closely, basically. So the levels of communicative facilitation, as we call them at the moment, are on the one hand interpersonal communication, which is largely about how we relate to each other. So it's about emotions, it is about relationships. Then we have the level that you could hopefully hear there, which is about good information and education and where to get that from. But then there's also the level of self-representation. But to some extent, that level of self-representation is at the top because it's not quite as important. So what role does television play in this process? And basically, we realized that there's obviously two levels of that. But interestingly, the self-representation bit feeds back into how we relate to each other. So it goes back into the relational and emotive level. So information and education is really important. Here are two responses to the screening at the top. You often don't think about the issues and contributors to climate change, but from these programs, it's allowed me to see the small first steps I could do to help. So this is about information and education, clearly. How the little things you do can have a massive impact on the environment. Again, you know, information and education. But then at the level of self-representation, these last two responses, how communities can come together to not just help each other, but also with climate change. And then the second person says, I feel energized and enthused. It was great to see ordinary people being so engaged. So this is about being able to see each other and to see yourself to some extent, or your neighbors or friends on the screen. But crucially, the last one in particular makes it really visible how much this is about emotions, how it is about how we relate to each other. And this is something that Rach Izar has pointed out as well. So here he says, within each nation, therefore, the task of enabling all groups that henceforth henceforth constitute the national community to assume ownership of an evolving composite cultural identity has become the question of the hour. This is not simply a matter of combating intolerance and exclusion, but also of giving dignity, voice and recognition in the public sphere to different cultural groups by constructing, negotiating a sense of national community. So local television really can help in constructing this national community by giving that sense of dignity, voice and recognition to those local communities and to those diverse communities. That word dignity came up again and again and again in our assemblies. It was really, really interesting to observe that. So just to conclude then, local television as reimagined as public service broadcasting can therefore be a support for resilient and sustainable communities. In particular, it can provide us with information and education, but also that sense of self-representation. And through that sense of self-representation, also connect us again to our neighbours. So again, you know, that feeding back into that emotive level of communication. However, this really requires a holistic approach, and that holistic approach needs to be connected also to other things, including spaces where people can meet. So one of the problems we have in Wavertree, for example, is that our local high street is at the moment just a motorway, so it's literally a thoroughfare. So that means that precisely that space to connect to the community on a face-to-face level is actually not available. That needs to change, and that's something that we're approaching the council with as a recommendation from our report. But what all of this highlights is that, you know, if we're looking at this approach in relation to climate change and community and local television holistically, we can create wonderful collaborations between policymakers, researchers and local community activists. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and in the meantime, I will share my link to the full programs. We only have 2 available at the moment, but there will be more being uploaded. So hopefully that will give you an idea. Okay, that's me.
Thank you so much, Elke. I'm eagerly waiting for the link to come into the chat. Okay, so taking us in a slightly different direction now, but still on the focus, with a focus on community, Matthew Cipa. Hope I got that right, or close.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to my the other presenters here for such interesting papers. I hope that my screen is viewable there, and then that's all good. So my paper is titled More Than Time, Television Space and a Sense of Community. And as Hannah indicated, that this is going in a slightly different direction than the previous 2 papers, but nevertheless, it is looking at the idea of community, and certainly at the importance of television in exploring the idea of community, just at a slightly more conceptual level, I suppose. So the field of television studies has made much of the medium's extended and interrupted storytelling time, especially relative to the shorter, continuous temporal qualities of cinema. And my concerns here are not so much with correcting this emphasis, but in extending it to consider what I term narrative space. So television's temporally extended capacity for storytelling underpins the complex and uniquely pleasurable challenges of paying close attention to television shows of any kind, and as well as for the possibility of rich engagement with multifaceted characters, both heroes and anti-heroes. So my interests in this paper are more to do with how the extension of storytelling time across seasons and episodes comes with or motivates an extension of storytelling space, and that this is critical to appreciating how television series and serials manage not just a depth of character depiction and the engagement that such depiction invites, but also how this depiction and engagement applies to a wide cast of characters. So one consideration I hope to open up in this paper is to do with how accounting for TV's narrative space affords an appreciation of the intersecting web of relationships between this wide cast of characters that might populate a work, and what actually informs these relationships. So how do we understand these relationships? What are the conditions or structures that give them shape within the work itself? And why might this be important, not just for the work, but our experience of it, what we can take out of it? So to get a better handle on these questions, I'd like to suggest that TV programs, because of the way the medium affords expanded narrative space, can have a preoccupation with the idea of community. So following philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, I understand communities as having a temporal dimension across which shared values and goods are worked out and worked toward with varying degrees of success. That communities are not just formed, but sustained through time to the extent that members of that community invest themselves in it and adhere to the shared understanding of goods and values that they work out, and that gives a particular community its identity. However, community also has a spatial dimension, namely the extent to which the community is defined and redefined, reinforced or threatened in terms of the individual members who comprise it and factors outside of the community itself. So the wellspring of a community is a shared foundation of values, interests, practices, and agreed upon internal goods. And so a community is not just a town, or not only a town, but the way I understand it here, a community can be a biological family. It can be a symbolic family, such as a crime family, a friendship group, a gang. It can be a workplace, or it can be a cultural, a political, or a religious group. And that this preoccupation with community is replicated formally in the community of a program's narrative organisation. That the variable ways in which episodes comes together and make seasons, and seasons come together to form a whole work. So with that in mind, my presentation today will more or less follow this structure. So I'll begin by having a look at the television medium and its intersectional relationship with time, how temporal prolongation motivates specific narrative challenges. I will then look a little bit in greater detail at the idea of community itself, and then consider that in terms of narrative space through two examples, Deadwood and The Wire. So again, as another point of departure here, I'll focus primarily on, or only actually, on fictional television programs. So, the television medium and time. For me, one of the clearest considerations of how time is a central feature of television as a medium is offered by Ted Nanicelli. And so I'll be using this as a kind of structuring device, I suppose, for the paper, his comments. So Nanicelli writes, and I quote, that the television medium is partly characterized by the understanding of the work as being temporally subdivided in various ways: series, season, episode, format, and so forth, and thus potentially having different sets of temporal boundaries, some of which are malleable in a way the temporal boundaries of films are not. So the understanding that the temporality of works in the television medium are more diverse, more variable, and more diffuse than those in the film medium. So we can have a narrative organisation as in Seinfeld, we can have a narrative organisation as in Peaky Blinders, as in, True Detective, as in Fargo, as in whatever television program takes your fancy. They're all working with the same units of episodes and seasons, but there's so many different ways in which this can be creatively adopted. And so it's sort of more, there's greater expressive potential, I suppose, in TV as compared to cinema. And so Nanicelli gives the example of, we can think of writing for narrative television in terms of A plots, B plots, all the way through to E plots. We can think about how narrative needs to be structured around commercial breaks, if indeed it's a broadcast television program. how narrative needs to be structured around episode breaks, the time in between seasons, and so on and so forth. All of these different features, all of these different potential ways in which the medium of television and time affect the narrative fall under the umbrella term of what Natochelli calls temporal prolongation. And he uses this term because, as he said, it carries with it connotations of a temporally unfolding, yet organically unified structure. So in the context of television, works are regularly created with no sense of when or how they might actually end. And they're temporally prolonged, bit by bit, for years, sometimes on end. And so in such cases, the temporal boundaries of works change after they have come into existence. And somewhat oddly, this happens through the creation of shorter distinct works that together constitute the longer ones. So there are particular challenges in terms of narrative and in terms of storytelling that are motivated by this prolongation, because often there's not necessarily a clear endpoint or a clear guarantee that the endpoint will be reached, and that the way in which the program works towards that endpoint might be worked out in the going. So in a more popular piece of, I suppose, television criticism, David Auerbach uses sort of cosmological models to draw an analogy to the different way in which, or the different ways in which television programs, look to meet these narrative or storytelling challenges. So the first model he offers is the steady state model, which is focused on the short term, with little attention paid to creating suspense towards some distant plot resolution that would signal, if not the end of the show, a major turning point. So he offers, the classic, however you'd like to take that term, television program, The Fugitive, where there is a general sort of ambient idea of an overarching story, but episode to episode, there's very little connection. There doesn't seem to be anything that might signal a distant plot point that the program is working toward, and that is very much focusing on narrative at the level of the episode. And for this sort of program, such as The Fugitive, or we might think of another also sort of older example like Quantum Leap, the episode is the more important narrative unit. That's where sort of the narrative is primarily focused. The next model that David Auerbach sort of looks to describe is the expansionary model. And here, as long as the show continues, no resolution can ever be final. The show story simply enlarges with new plot elements and characters injected into it. And as is often the case with the benefit of hindsight, Lost is perhaps a fairly clear example that falls under the expansionary model, in the sense that it was continually enlarging, continually expanding in terms of its narrative, in terms of plot twists and characters and that sort of thing, that by the time it finally reached its resolution, it could only, fail in many respects, both to draw all those threads together and to offer something of sort of satisfaction, I suppose, to spectators. And the third model that Auerbach writes about is what he calls the big crunch model. So in this use of time and the medium of television to tell a narrative, the developments over a series genuinely do constrain the actual ending, limiting the possibilities. The big crunch model attempts to merge the focus of the steady state model, that first model, with the long-term suspense of the second model, the expansionary model, putting in clues that will mostly, hopefully, add up in the end. And that the big crunch show does not need to have a definitive ending planned out from the beginning. Rather, the show constrains its possible destinations as it goes on, minimizing pointless detours and expansionary subplots. So the idea here is that the big crunch model does not have a clear, distinct, singular endpoint in mind as the show is unfolding. merely that there are legitimate, plausible possibilities that are somewhat constrained, and that in doing so, it balances both episode to episode interest of that first model with sort of the more long-term suspense and payoff of the second one. So I mentioned all of these models, and I've begun talking about the medium and television's temporal prolongation, because I think that if the way in which a particular work of television is temporally subdivided and prolonged affects the way in which the story world unfolds, and therefore the way the characters behave and interact, and therefore the way the narrative develops, the medium and its use of time in a particular work is central and constitutes in important ways how that work will explore the idea of community. And so for now, I thought I would give a little bit of a clearer conceptual or definitional sense of what I mean when I talk about community. So one philosopher puts it in interpreting the work of Alasdair MacIntyre, who I'm drawing on here, that MacIntyre is working through the framework of virtue ethics, so whereby social rules are to be explained in terms of the minimal requirements for preservation of that moral community. And so that community, MacIntyre suggests, comprises those who are willing to cooperate in seeking a common good as defined by a common tradition. And so the individuals that populate that community will be more adept or skillful at doing so in sustaining the community, in sort of maintaining the common good on which it is founded than others. So some will be skillful at doing that, and others will be inept. The latter will merely fail to contribute as much as the former. However, some people will harm the effort, not by contributing less than the normally adept, but by positively detrimental acts. So on this sort of view of community, we have three types of individuals or characters, if we'd like to keep it in the context of television, who form part of the community: high contributors, low contributors, and harmers, for lack of a better term. And so one way in which we can understand how a work of television is exploring the idea of community is by first of all identifying that community and its sense of its own internal common good and the tradition from which that emerges. So what are the identifying aspects of the community? What is it actually working toward? But we can also think about how the individuals populating a television program are contributing to or harming it, are redefining it, the bounds and interests and identity of a particular community. So to go to the man himself, Alasdair MacIntyre, he wrote that those who participated in such a project, the project of a community, would need to develop two quite different types of evaluative practice. On the one hand, they would need to value, to praise as excellences, those qualities of mind and character which contribute to the realisation of their common good or goods. And remember, since MacIntyre is working through the philosophical framework of virtue ethics, he sees these as virtues and then a corresponding set of vices. But those who participate in a community would also need to identify certain types of actions as the doing or the production of harm of such in order that they destroy the bonds of community. So it's not just a matter of identifying high and low contributors, but it's also a matter of identifying individuals within or without the community who are sort of actively harming it or are making the achievement of its goals, of its aims or its goods not possible. So one of the compelling ways in which works of television can explore the idea of community is simply by showing characters working through the very things that MacIntyre is talking about and that I just suggested that we as spectators could work through. They can show us characters identifying the contributors and the harmers of a given community, as well as showing us characters identifying and redefining the goods and tradition which give the community its identity. So with all of that in mind, let's turn to an example now. One of the reasons I think Deadwood is a compelling example is because it's set in a nascent community. The town of Deadwood is a place of flux and transition, or it's a place of a social community that's in formation, that's searching for its identity. So that quote up there is from Jason Jacobs, who writes that Deadwood is a return to first principles, to a point of origin where the fundamentals of society organisation are worked up and lived out. And so the program follows a wide cast of characters whose lives influence and intersect each other in a variety of ways. The narrative capacities of television are suited to the quantity of character arcs and their development, and through the world building that accumulates across episodes and seasons, spectators are immersed in the social locus of the program. So it's no wonder that in the town of Deadwood, as I said, a town still nascent and undergoing formation, and as yet to establish its identity and a shared understanding of values and goods, that the afflictions of others, often due to the violence of the world in which they find themselves, often overcomes the still underdeveloped sense of community. So in Deadwood then, because we're treated to this nascent community that lacks a clear identity, it is being competed over by various individuals looking to define its common good by their own personal good. And so we see this in various characters that are central to the show. We see it in Al Swearingen, we see it in Seth Bullock, and we see it in Cy Tolliver, among others. Any of these characters could count as high contributors or low contributors or harmers because the community is new and it lacks an identity. And so the shared understanding of what individuals are contributing to it, if anything, is still being worked out, is still being defined. So what Deadwood dramatizes then is precisely this contest, and it does so through the rich depiction of multiple characters, their relationships with each other in the context of the town or the community of Deadwood. And the reason this is so effectively explored, I would suggest, is precisely because of the temporal prolongation of the medium of television and the way in which its compositional and textural narrative form, that is, the way in which it affords enhanced extended narrative space, allows for the web of richly depicted characters to unfold and intersect. So one final example before I conclude. So the way in which medium, formal variability, that is how episodes and seasons can be used to tell a story, and temporal prolongation, all are sort of central to the medium of television. And they underpin character development in a way that I think is interesting and notable in terms of how it relates to this idea of community that I've sketched so far in this paper. So as Robert Blanchett and Margareta Brunvarga note, television series can enhance familiarity with a particular story world and characters to a greater extent than can feature films. This is not just an aspect of time, but it's an aspect of space. It's an aspect of who is populating the world or the community of a particular work, and how is the form and the medium of TV being used to enrich each of these characters, as well as the relationships they have with others. And so writing about this very aspect, Elliot Logan suggests that serial television drama is produced in an unfolding series of discrete but nevertheless interrelated parts, namely episodes and seasons. And what follows from this fact is that the textual composition of such works is characterized by a peculiar tension between the unified and the fragmentary, between the discrete part and the greater whole, which are at once separate and connected. So the medium-specific features of television that I've been returning to throughout this paper, namely temporal prolongation, as compared to that of film, dictates how these stories are told and the sorts of stories that can be told. Moreover, the way in which the features that Logan writes about intersect and mimic at the level of form the very idea of community is sort of reinforces at the level of content that same theme. So with additional narrative time, comes the opportunity for characters' interests and behaviours and motivations to grow or to change. And so their relation to a community as contributors or harmers can therefore also change, and as such, the community changes with them. The Wire explores a series of communities which have failed or are failing, or at least have been depicted as such. And this is something that Martin Schuster gets out in his detailed account of The Wire, that there's a lack of a normative ground to any of the institutions that are on display, and that it's a contest that the terms of which and the various communities that make up the program change as the motivations of the characters do. And the motivations are able to change because of the way in which The Wire makes use of temporal prolongation afforded by television. And so Schuster also writes that in spite of the fact that its characters do act, and often with conviction, no action or conviction, indeed no institution, presents reasons that stand up as reasons in terms of character motivation and behaviour. So even as reasons are proffered, for example, it's all in the game, these reasons cannot bear scrutiny, for the way in which they are embedded in a broader structure is ultimately unreasonable. The parts do not add up to a whole. So if reasons are one ways in which characters give expression for their understanding of the goods that constitute and define a community, it is no coincidence that in a program which, as Schuster notes, features no reasons or motivations that hold up, the communities themselves are failing. However, that's what makes, in my view, The Wire so compelling. The way in which it uses narrative form, the way in which it uses temporal prolongation in the medium of television, and the way in which Deadwood or Atlanta or Peaky Blinders or make use of these same features is exactly the way in which community can be so uniquely explored through TV. So the medium-specific features of temporal prolongation and the formal variability that comes with that explores and allows us, the spectators, to consider the importance of community, about what defines it and how it can change not just through time, but through the expanded narrative space afforded by the medium of TV. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. What a way to finish. Okay, so if I'm going to invite the speakers back onto the screen. Hello, and I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So you can either raise your hand or pop questions in the chat. Just warning you, I have chair's privilege and I will use it. Okay, then I'm going to kick us off with a question. So, Jana, in your really interesting paper, you asked two questions that I think anybody who's writing about television should always be thinking about these things, but particularly when we're thinking about the question of community and how television forms or represents communities. Firstly, it's what do we analyze and how? But secondly, and this is what I want to ask all of you, who is actually watching? So can we all speak a little bit about where the audience comes in to our various projects? Let's start with you, Jana, because you did ask the question.
Thank you. Those are very important and very interesting questions, actually. I didn't start my research yet. I'm in the phase of preparing to start the project. And this presentation was actually coming from a bit of a frustration on the lack of literature and sources on regional television. I actually, before COVID, in December 2019, I was a part of a board that was actually deciding whether some of the regional televisions in our region will get the money from the town of Olomouc or not for their services. And the question of audiences was one of the first ones that the board actually asked. And the televisions, when they were supposed to explain who is actually watching their broadcasting, all of them had the same answer, that they had these assumed audiences, because in Czech Republic you actually don't measure regional numbers for the viewers, only the national televisions, with one exception, that is in the region that is near Prague, our capital. So those televisions actually don't have the methodology how to measure their audiences. They just know that there is such and such number of assumed audiences in the region they are operating, and they assume all of those audiences are watching them, which obviously isn't the case. And to me, it's really interesting to ask the question of who actually is watching it. What does actually mean that somebody is watching television? Because as I mentioned, most of those regional televisions are actually focusing more and more on social media. So they, as Elke mentioned in her presentation, lots of those televisions aren't actually doing television. They do films or they do posts on Facebook and Instagram, and occasional films and documentaries that they post on YouTube. So I have no idea who's watching regional television. They have lots of posts and likes on social media, but I do suspect that those are not the same audiences that actually watch linear regional television, because those one are older, definitely older audiences, and Instagram is for way younger people. So I actually don't have answer, but I would be interested in knowing that as well.
So would I. Elke?
Yeah, we've got a similar problem to some extent. So we were obviously able to know who came to the screening that we held at Wavertree Town Hall. And it was people who were quite heavily involved in Love Wavertree as it is, largely as well, some local politicians, which was nice. And then we had, so we're going to send the screenings out properly once we have basically most of them finished via the newsletter. And again, it'd be local people primarily, and mostly people who are already involved. To some extent, we're really struggling with getting the people that are not involved. I would love to be able to work with some of the established outlets in Liverpool. So there's 2 newspapers at the moment that are doing quite well. Well, the Liverpool Echo is the most established one, and it would be great to work with them, but anything to do with climate change they find icky, so they're not interested. And the Post, the Post is maybe not still too young to basically be interested as well. But we're planning more screenings locally as well. So we're planning screenings at potentially the Fact, which is the main venue for alternative kind of cinema and television in Liverpool. And then we're going into different community places as well and see if we can screen it there as well. So yeah, at the moment it's vague basically, but it's a very good question. Who's the audience, and do we reach the audience that we want to reach in a way?
Yeah, it seems to me that that question is like the it's the proof of concept, right? So once you've managed to reach these audiences, and then what? And so that's where you get to. Can I put the question to you, Matthew, but in a slightly different way? So for most of the people in this room, the communities that are being represented in the programs that you're talking about seem very, very distant, almost exotic. How does that connect to the sort of virtue ethics led philosophy of community that you're talking about? In other words, if we feel distance from the community that we are seeing represented, does that affect how we understand that community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think you're right. There is a point of difference there in that in both Jana and Elke's examples, perhaps there's an expectation that the community represented in the programs being spoken about in their papers is in some way representative of the audience, and because it's speaking to that community. But when you're looking at a fictional drama like Deadwood, or you're looking at a fictional drama like, any of the ones I spoke about, you're right, there's a sort of disconnect there. I suppose that one way in which the connection might be established is by looking at, well, what is actually identifying a particular community, and does that have relevance to a particular spectator or a particular individual? So, for example, to take the last case I looked at, which is The Wire, dealing with sort of failing institutions, failing communities, both in terms of ones that are political and sort of run by the state, or run by, it's set in Baltimore in the United States, so run by that particular area and that sort of thing. The program has sort of seen a continued and almost increased resonance in the United States, given the sorts of things that are happening over there politically with police and how they're dealing with crime and that sort of thing at a national level. So sort of the interest is not contained to the community of Baltimore, but the way in which that show is asking us to think about the idea of itself and how it's sort of materially or socially embedded within our sort of our broader lives, I think has resonance for individuals and for spectators who may not actually be within it. So I would say probably from that level, in the way in which it asks us to consider, well, what is identifying the communities we see on screen, and how does that actually resonate with me personally or with any particular individual, is how the connection is established.
You're muted, Hannah.
Thank you. Oh, goodness. It's been 2.5 years. I was just checking to see if we have any further questions in the chat, but we don't. Do you have any questions that you would like to ask each other?
I kind of do.
Go ahead.
So I found, first of all, can I just say my thank you to my co-presenters, because I found your papers really, really interesting. And the point of time, Matthew, really struck a chord with me, because, in a way, to some extent, time is part of tradition, isn't it, as well, and the development of tradition. But to some extent, television needs to develop its own tradition, particularly when it's about connecting to audiences in order to create that community. So it's not, I don't know if it's a question, but in a way, what role does time play also, not just from representation point of view, but precisely from that audience point of view? So how when you think about these series, they were made to be watched obviously long term, but not all of us will. So how can we make sure that there is this long-term engagement with content in order to create that sense of community, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's quite a question, Elke. But it's a good one. It is a really interesting one, and I think perhaps the more instructive examples would be series that have failed for whatever reason, because it might be easy to look at The Wire, or The Sopranos, or Deadwood, or whichever your favorite TV program happens to be, that was able to, Deadwood's a bit of a trickier case, but was able to sort of see it through to the end. There's, I guess, a presumption there that the audience was there to see it through to the end, at least as it ran through. But I would imagine for the failure studies, exactly. So I would imagine that I had up there an example, Carnivale, which I think was a show on HBO that had 2 seasons that I watched and I found, kind of interesting, not outstanding necessarily, but interesting. And then it just died a miserable death, and no one was watching it, and so it failed to establish the community. So, you would look to the text itself, I would imagine, to try and see if there's anything going on. But I don't think you can also isolate the text from the social context, the production context, and that sort of thing as well. So I think it's a question that needs to take into account all sides when we think about why did this program fail to sort of establish a community, to see its time through to the end. It's not necessarily just about what sort of, from where I come from, aesthetic flaws, quote unquote, the text itself might have, characters not being well realized, plot holes, that sort of thing. It might be that the audience wasn't there. It might be that it didn't have appropriate backing from the production side of things as well. So I think I don't have an answer for you, but I think the way in which you'd start to figure the answer out would be that sort of holistic approach that is taking into account the different sides of the television program.
What do you think, Elke, on that question? But perhaps thinking about this in relation also to non-fiction programming, how would it work out then?
Yeah, I think in that regard, the fact that you have more serial documentaries and serial lifestyle television and stuff, I think that does work in terms of, particularly when you think about programs such as Gardener's World, there is a real sense of community around it, also because viewers can now participate in the program itself. So it's the right, filming something from your garden and then sending that in. And so that there is a sense of, there's more than just the show. There's also an audience that participates, and then there is also all the other stuff that they do. So it highlights again that television is not, if it wants to have a community, it cannot stand separate from what goes on elsewhere. It needs to engage with the audience in ways that also enable face-to-face interaction. There is a Gardener's World gardening show. So yeah.
We are actually out of time, but I do have one more question if everybody is going to indulge me. And this is about, and this is more for Elke and Jana, to be honest, but growing up, the idea of being on television to me was the most special, extraordinary thing that I could possibly imagine. The idea of myself appearing on television. But when television becomes at this micro local level, I think was the term you used, Elke, is that right? That kind of specialness, that sheen of celebrity that television confers would seem to be reduced. Is this a benefit of local television? Elke saying yes. How does it work?
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think in the UK, in particular, if I compare that to Germany, television is everywhere. Television, because there's so much television being made in the UK in comparison to how much there's a lot of television being made in Germany as well, but it just doesn't manage to reach that kind of. I think it doesn't manage to reach those local places in the same way that British television does. And I think that's a good thing, because it reduces also the distance to the presenters and to the actors and stuff. And so I think that's a good thing, because it means that we can actually imagine ourselves as a national community via television, which I don't think is always possible in Germany. In Germany, television is so distant. It doesn't help with national community building, for example. So yeah, I think it's good.
Jana, do you have any sense of people's responses to appearing on television in the case of Czechia?
In general, I think it in Czech Republic, Czech Public Service Television has a strong hold on the community and the idea of being Czech, being a part of this Slavic nation that really, as I mentioned in the presentation, we see ourselves as like purely Slavic, but we are in the center of Europe, and our history is quite connected to Germany, for example, to Austria, to Slovakia, and a bit of to Hungary as well. So there's actually nothing purely Slavic about traditions in Czech Republic. It's a mashup, basically. But in a local level, I think it's not about single people being a part of TV broadcasting, but about the community and the events that are held in the community. I actually come from a very little village in the Eastern Bohemia, and we are despite being very tiny village, we have a castle, medieval castle. So we are a place that is often visited by tourists. And we have quite a lot of traditions and festivities during the year that are connected to that specific history. And there are quite a lot of regional magazines about the castle, about the village, holidays, and so on. And it's usually never about a single people. It's about the village, the community that lives in the village, and about the festivities that are being held on the castle. So I don't think that's necessarily about people seeing each other, but about people seeing their community in TV and on the screens.
Thanks. I mean, I think this is a topic that could run and run, but I do think also I should bring things to a close. Thank you so much to Elke, Jana, and Matthew for such wonderful papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
And for sharing.
Oh, thanks. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Take care.
Are you staying around, Elke?
Yeah, it takes me a while to stop recording and stuff.
Okay.
What did you think of the program?
I liked it.